And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather again, low pressure moves into the Gulf of Alaska out of Bristol Bay here, and the front brings gusty winds and snow to the panhandle, and there's winter storm warnings and winter weather advisories out for moderate to heavy snow for the southeast coast for later tonight and tomorrow, and snow up here across the North Gulf Coast, Kenai Peninsula area, and especially with this trough over the Bristol Bay area. Gusty northwest winds, a lot of snow showers, Bering Sea side of the Alaska Peninsula, snow showers eastern Aleutians to the Pribilofs, and dry over the northern interior, with a few flurries on the Arctic coast for tomorrow. Lighter winds, still some snow showers for the Pribilofs down to the Fox Islands. Gusty winds, maybe to 50 miles an hour still, or 35 to 50 for the Alaska Peninsula with snow showers. Next system on the edge of the chart there, ready to move in. This front moves right up along the North Gulf Coast and the Panhandle. And then a pretty windy day, especially for the normally windier areas here, south central Alaska, like the Matanuska Valley, Resurrection Bay, and eastern Turnagain Arm into Whittier there for west winds in those locations. Still snow and rain for the southeast coast, depending on your elevation and latitude. And light snow along and north of the Alaska Range there. Dry, chilly over the interior, flurries along the Arctic coast. This next system bringing increasing wind, rain, and snow to the Aleutians, and that's spreading eastward throughout the day. Coastal water forecast for the south coast of the Panhandle tomorrow. Definitely gale force winds as that system approaches the coast. Southeast 45 knots, and then for the north and central coast, east 45 to 50 knots or 40 to 50 knots. And for Lynn Canal, southeast winds 20 knots, gust to 35, small craft advisories for Stevens Passage, southeast 25 knots, gale warnings for Clarence Strait, southeast winds 35 knots, seas 11 feet. And the forecast for Wednesday, Clarence Strait, winds still southeast at 20 knots with higher gusts, but north here for the central and northern inside channel, strongest for Lynn Canal out of the north at 30 knots. And for the south coast here, south to southeast winds at 25 knots, east-northeast 30 knots for the central and north coast, and the extreme north coast here, northeast is 15 to 25 knots. Cook Inlet tomorrow, small craft advisories, north winds 25 to 30 knots, good gales here for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands, northwest at 40 knots, north 35 knots here for the western North Gulf Coast, and east winds 45 to 50 knots for the eastern North Gulf Coast with the seas under 20 feet, just under 20 feet. Prince William Sound, small craft advisories, east winds 30 knots with 7-foot seas. And those turn north at 30 knots with 6-foot seas for the Sound there on Wednesday. And for the North Gulf Coast, north winds 30 to 35 knots, north at 20 for Cook Inlet. Storm warnings, Kamishak Bay, northwesterlies 50 knots, Barren Islands northwest at 45 knots. Kodiak Island, gale warnings tomorrow, northwest winds 35 knots. And gale warnings here for the Alaska Peninsula, northwest winds 30 to 40 knots. Gale warnings for Bristol Bay, northwest winds 35 knots. And for the Wednesday outlook, lighter winds, small craft advisories now for the Alaska Peninsula, winds northwest 25 to 30 knots. Bristol Bay, northwest at 30 knots. And for Kodiak Island, northwest winds 40 to 45 knots. For the eastern Aleutians tomorrow, northwest winds at 35 knots and under gale force there at 30 knots out of the northwest for Adak and Atka. And for the western Aleutians, west winds 15 to 25 knots. Then on Wednesday, as that next system moves in, we've got the gale warnings for southeast winds 35 knots from Kiska Island westward, Amchitka southeast at 30, Adak and Atka south at 20, and the eastern Aleutians, Nikolsky west 15 on Alaska Island, northwest 25. And for the area for Norton Sound, St. Lawrence Island, Yukon Delta coast, Tuesday, north winds 25 knots, northwest 30 knots, south of Nunivak Island, north at 20 for St. Matthew Island, northwest 20 for the Pribilofs. And then for Wednesday, northwest winds 15 knots for Norton Sound and St. Lawrence Island, northwest 20 here for the Yukon Delta coast. And the Kuskokwim Delta coast, north at 20, north 20 also there for St. Matthew Island. Small craft advisories for the Pribilofs, northwest winds 30 knots, seas 10 feet. Eastern Beaufort Sea coast tomorrow, West winds 20 to 30 knots, strongest Kaktovik there eastward, and the central Arctic coast, central and western Arctic coast, west winds of 15 knots, and the Chukchi Sea, northwest winds 15 to 25 knots. And for Wednesday, Chukchi Sea, northwest 15 knots, 10 to 15 knot westerlies here for the western coast, central coast, west of 15. Brisk wind advisories for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast for west winds 25 to 30 knots.